So I'm talking here with Natalie Judd, who joins me from Shanghai, where she has spent a couple weeks now in lockdown with her husband and two young daughters, ages 3 and 5. She's an American from Portland, or calls Portland home. I know you were briefly in the US, and so obviously there were complaints in the US about COVID restrictions, etc. So just like
Mhm.
to the extent that you can even try to translate what the situation is in China to Americans who dealt with I don't even know what the most draconian steps were. Like, I guess those early couple of weeks of quarantine where like it was
Yeah.
suggested not to leave the house.
Yep. So we flew back to the States late January of 2020. So we considered ourselves refugees, tongue in cheek. Went back to the States, and through February, like we knew what was coming. COVID wasn't really a thing here, and then March it heated up, and then by late March, it was like everybody was staying at home. And so yes, I think Americans think they locked down, right? They stayed home, school was virtual. Um, but key differences being you could still leave your house, you could still walk the dog, you could still go to Target, you could still go to the grocery store, right, and get basically all the essentials. You could still have any kind of food you wanted delivered or ordered. There were a couple days of disruption, right, as this systems tried to figure out how to handle this. But draconian is the best word to talk about what's happening here as opposed to what happened in the States, because here, no, you don't leave your house, you don't walk the dog, you don't get groceries, you can't have and so Shanghai, it's really hard for people in the States to understand both the supply chain here and the food situation. The Chinese meal plan is all based on really fresh foods. Nobody does non-perishables. And so people shop every 2 to 3 days. And if they don't shop in person, they have it all delivered. And so the problem now in Shanghai is there is the supply, but there's no chain in which to move it along. And so essential workers, I think I read somewhere there's 10,000 Kuaidi drivers is what they call it, is delivery people bringing things. But there's 26 million people who live in Shanghai. So the numbers just don't add up. And so the food situation is you can't have things delivered. You cannot have food brought in. And so it's wildly different than where we were at in the States a few years ago, 2 years actually, like just over 2 years ago, is that we could still take our girls outside. They rode their scooters, their bikes, we took walks, we exercised, we jogged, we went out, and then still, of course, went to the stores. And you might have had to wait in line to get in or to stand, on tape on the ground 6 feet from the person in front of you. But there was never food scarcity. I know there's like the great toilet paper debacle of whatever that was. But it was nowhere near like it's been here whatsoever. And so it's funny because even until we talk face to face or Zoom to Zoom or FaceTime to FaceTime with folks in the West, they cannot understand what it's like here, really, until you talk through the details of specifically what lockdown means here. It's a totally foreign concept for people to understand.
And you're coming to me from your apartment right now in Shanghai?
That's right. Yep.
And when is the last time you were able to leave your apartment?
Well, we had a COVID test outside 3 days ago. So in theory, we breathed fresh air a few days ago. But with the freedom to roam about, we have been locked down in our community roughly since March 20th. So there were a handful of days where maybe like 1 or 2 days in there where we could go outside in our community here. But other than that, we've been locked in to our apartment.
And when you say your community, what is that?
So yeah, so in Shanghai, the concept of a neighborhood is really broken down kind of to what we could consider a compound. Gated community, we have 4 or 5 buildings here. There's about 800 people in our compound. So gated complex. And this is just par for the course in Shanghai, how people live. And so when we do go outside, like we have to stay within our compound community. So we have some small walking trails and there's a playground here for kids to play on. So there is some freedom within, we call it the inside outside, right, to go outside. But that's where our testing takes place in our community as well. So we've not seen outside our complex in quite some time.
And why did they make the decision to ban you from going outside?
So on Sunday, March 26th, I think that was it. Anyway, we'd already been locked into our compound for a few days, but citywide, the government announced that they were going to lock down the half of the river that we live on. So it's called Pudong. The other side of the river is called Puxi. And it's basically kind of splits the city into two. And they were going to lock down Pudong for 4 days. Hard lockdown, everybody in their apartments, nobody leaves. And then at the end of that 4th day, we would release and come out, and the other half of the city would lock down and go into lockdown. Well, the end of our 4th day came, and we figured it was highly unlikely we were going to get out because cases were still like exponentially climbing. And sure enough, we've stayed on lockdown since then. So I think we were originally supposed to get out on April 1st. It's now April 12th. The other side of the other half of the city has also now been locked down this whole time as well.
And as far as not leaving your apartment, is that because there was a positive COVID case? Explain to me how you understand the rules to be working right now.
Yeah, and it's a great comment how we understand the rules to be working, because the goalposts keep shifting. Some rules have stayed fairly consistent. So basically, of course, nobody wants to get COVID. That's the first thing, because you could, in theory, get sent to Camp COVID. I'm sure we'll probably talk about that. But if your building stays free from cases, that's the best you can hope for, right? Your building stays free, you stay on kind of like a lower level of lockdown than if someone in your building, it marks positive, you get locked down in a different way with a longer time horizon on it. And if someone in your community or your compound tests positive, your compound is then under kind of a different set of rules. And so luckily my compound here, we have no cases in our compound, we have no cases in our building. And so in theory, based on the rules we know to be true, if we were to be released based on kind of some flow charts that the government sends out, we would in theory be some of the first released. However, like those flowcharts have kept getting published, but then the dates keep shifting and keep extending out. And so no one really knows when it's going to end at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, besides going out for testing, do you have any sense of when you might be able to just hang out outside for a couple hours? Like, is it days from now, weeks from now?
So it's interesting, even since we were messaging last night, there's been some shifting change. And so this is the wildest thing about this whole experience. It's so dynamic that it changes from night to morning. You wake up and something's totally different. So the government has announced that there are, across the city, they're going to start releasing people today. And so it depends on the level of your compound, of what we just spoke through, if there's cases or not. And if there aren't, in theory, they're going to start releasing people today. And so we saw early this morning, there are a few compounds on the, or not compounds, there are a few areas of town on the other side of the river that have been released. So people are out and wandering around. We're waiting on our side of the river to see if anybody will get released. Our side of the river, Pudong, is one of the higher cased regions, districts is what they call them. And so it's unclear what's going to happen on our side. We're waiting, like anxiously, everyone's watching the WeChat groups to see if things will open up. Just to see what happens. But again, China's pretty dedicated to this COVID zero strategy. And so now we all wonder, okay, we've been locked in for almost a month. Cases are still increasing every day. If you test positive, you're still going to a central quarantine. So now what does the policy become, as now we're going to start reintroducing people back into the wild?
Yeah, I just spoke with in the last hour, I spoke to the New York Times bureau chief in Beijing. And I said, like, based on what do you get from the Chinese officials as far as what's going on in Shanghai? And he's like, no, their mistake wasn't zero COVID. Their mistake was not having the logistics of getting food to people. That's how the Chinese government is thinking about it right now.
There's a lot that can be said about the government. I don't know what you're pursuing or thinking about, but the governments, they're sort of, just as we've read and heard, there's inner conflict right now within the CCP. They aren't a monolith. And so there is sort of warring factions a little bit between Shanghai and Beijing. And so like there's been turnover in the politics of who's managing the lockdown situation and what's happening. And it's because of the way that information is distributed here and verified versus rumor versus the Chinese way of doing things versus the West, it's super unclear ever to figure out exactly what the truth is.
You mentioned WeChat groups. I'd love to get describe for us how you get information. How are you getting your news? How do you learn about whether you can leave the building? How do you learn? How are you learning things minute by minute, hour by hour? How do you know how to live?
So for folks who don't know, WeChat is like the all-encompassing social app here in China. It's a mixture of Facebook and Venmo and Twitter. It's just all-inclusive. And essentially, you live and die by the communications you have. So WeChat groups form. Basically, you can get added, subtracted, you find groups, and information is just distributed within those. So we're part of our compound WeChat group. Many groups have spun up since then as we're working through group food orders. There's 3 different groups I'm a part of, one in English, one in Chinese, and actually 2 in Chinese, and then just a building group chat. So there's information flying constantly. People are just chatting nonstop. It's very noisy, I won't lie. I've had to remove myself from a few because it's just all encompassing. It's sort of anxiety inducing to some way. So because we don't speak or read Chinese, we're a little bit at the mercy of translation apps and people in our building and compound and people I work with who will help us translate or help us understand what exactly is going on. And so how we get information fed to us is typically through groups or subscriptions to local news media outlets that someone is translating into English. So there's sort of expat friendly communication channels that you can read, though they heavily slant to being, again, like China friendly. So there's some spin to what's posted. And so throughout our whole experience, as the goalposts have moved, as our dates have changed, it's always a little unclear what's happening. And even our Chinese neighbors, they themselves have started to highlight the difficulties in the comms coming out. It's unclear to them. Sometimes we'll get papers slid under our door with Chinese on one side and English on the other. And just the way that things are written, there's a little bit of double speak in the way things come about, where it could be interpreted one way or the other. And he feels like there's wiggle room a little bit being purposefully left around how they can still continue to change and shift the policies based on whatever's happening in a given moment. And so it's a little go with the flow. And honestly, there's not much that we can do. And so you can immerse yourself in it and trying to figure it out. But at the end of the day, you can only get yourself so far in trying to seek for what that truth is.
It's Orwellian the way you describe it, seeking, figuring out truth. What is truth right now? But while these lockdowns are happening, are people continuing to work remotely? Is school happening?
So this is my 6th week of working from home. So we started working from home on March the 8th because there was a scare that there was a second close contact of somebody who had COVID. And so they were going to lock that building down. And we had up to that point, so remember, this is early March, this is 6 weeks ago. We have known people who were locked down into their office building for a week, stayed at the office, slept at the office because they just locked down wherever there was
wrong place at the wrong time.
Wrong, and absolutely, that's sort of how it's been almost this whole calendar year. Things started to pick up in March with people getting locked in. I mean, people locked into fabric markets. There's talk about people being locked in a Uniqlo inside a mall where you spend either 2 days until tests come back, or this friend of ours at GM stayed there for an entire week. So we came home because, again, there was fear that there was a second close contact of a single person in one building. So they shut down our whole campus. We started working from home March 8th, and we've been home since then. They canceled school, or sorry, they moved school virtually at the end of that week. So starting March 10th, March 11th, whatever those dates are, across the city, international schools, Chinese schools, all children are doing virtual learning at home. So we've been online. I think this is their 5th week now of being online.
How are they doing with that?
Oh gosh, I have a 5-year-old. And so that's a really challenging age. It takes my husband full time to monitor her and stay online. My 3-year-old has nothing to do. So she's the monster in our house mostly. But I mean, most Americans have gone through it, the virtual schooling, right? This is the first time our kids have done virtual schooling since early 2020. And my kids weren't old enough to do school back then. So this is my first foray into virtual schooling. And it's been a real challenge. And I can't imagine it's really any different than most experience of Westerners. But again, you layer that on top of the low to mid-level anxiety about food and gathering food. And then on top of that, about not being able to go outside. And then trying to keep spirits high to encourage and love learning while trying to be on a virtual school is a real challenge. We've just come off spring break. Our international school is on spring break, and gosh, these first 2 days have been sort of a nightmare, and trying to shift back to that.
Talk to me about the process of finding food. How does it work, and how does it work for you versus say, the average Chinese person, is it different for expats versus the Chinese? How does that process work right now?
Yeah, absolutely. It's honestly, it's pretty inconsistent, the spread of food across town. So I'll give you some examples. So I live in it's not just an expat community, but it's a gated community on the river, pretty upper scale. The people who live here have quite a bit of money. And so it seems like our compound has quite a bit of access to the outside world through connections. Somebody has a connection at Procter and Gamble or Unilever, they get stuff sent in. We have connections, just and on and on. So,
but people are having to leverage their personal connections. It's not like, the grocery store is delivering.
There's some of that. Let me go back. The first week we were at home is a little different than it is now. So back that first week, it was a free for all for everyone. You could try, so us included, would try to order from the grocery stores, online apps, try to grocery store. So you'd know what time they came available, and you'd just click, trying to fight what you would consider bots, but it's really just people trying to get groceries delivered. We went for a stretch of maybe 8 or 9 days without being able to order anything in. Luckily, we have that Western style pantry, so we were fine. We have plenty to live on, but most people don't live that way. And so for 8 or 9 days, every day we'd try and we'd say, okay, well, maybe tomorrow. And so that's continued for a good number of people. We found out after a while that the grocery stores would not deliver to our compound. They were only doing group orders. Some places are still continuing to do individuals, like I'll order as an individual for my family and we'll bring stuff in. But most companies have now pivoted to this idea of a group order. A minimum threshold gets set, either a dollar amount, and I would say, let's see, 3,000 RMB is maybe $500 or so. So you'd either or 50 orders of something, but like a pretty substantial amount of food to be brought in for your individual compound or community. And so even to have things delivered now though, so the companies have gotten smarter about it. They now have the supply chain a little bit better figured out. And so then you're at the mercy of convincing someone, the company at the other end, to bring something into your community, and then having enough interest from people to order. So back to WeChat groups, we have an English speaking food ordering WeChat group, and you just watch to see what's posted. And if you're interested in 12 mangoes, you put your name on this list, and then we wait to see if we can get 20 people who are interested enough in that order, then they'll reach out and try to order that. Sometimes they get filled, sometimes they don't. So there's this ongoing churn of what's happening. Our community has 12 volunteers now who just around the clock are vetting people, vetting the distributors, making sure they have the right nucleic acid tests, making sure they have the right permits to come in. I mean, it's a full-time job for everyone trying to find food. So that's at the group compound level. There are many compounds and areas and neighborhoods across town who can't do any group order, who can't have anything delivered in. And so there are people, friends of ours, we're continuing to watch. We were lucky and were able to send 2 boxes of food over to a friend maybe early last week, which is a handful of staples because they'd been hard locked into their apartment since March 12th. They've been in for a very long time, and we're able to send food over. In certain areas, the government is delivering food, but it's a scattershot of what people get. Sometimes it might be like 1 carrot and a turnip. Someone might get a bunch of meat and milk. Is very inconsistent across the city. And so it's impossible to tell. There's no schedule of what's going to come. There's no consistency with what comes or who gets it. Of course, all the information we get is anecdotal from people who've heard something, or maybe you have a first point connection. We've gotten a lot of information from Twitter and Reddit, right? We do have access to VPN, we can see across. And so there's a lot of crowdsourcing conversations trying to find out where people are at, how to help. But in certain cases, some compounds won't even allow deliveries to be made. And so that's just on the food front. You think people are running out of medication. People are having emergent health needs and are having difficulty in getting out of their compounds or difficulty in getting to hospitals. There's always questions around how do I leave China, and some compounds won't even let people leave to get to the airport. So it's just it's this high pressure situation. The underlying, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is food sits at the very bottom, and without food, that makes everything more challenging. And then it just gets more complicated when you start to layer in all the other facets of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, what caught a lot of people's attention over the weekend, especially, were all the videos that were coming out of, what you rarely see in China, defiance on the part of the citizenry to authorities. What have you personally witnessed any of that? I mean, to the extent that you can, given your life in your apartment.
No, not so much, and it's also hard. Those videos are really difficult because it's always a little unclear as to what's happening. Some of them are, of course, very straightforward. We've seen ones of defiance. You can, they're somewhat verified based on dates or time. I mean, there's horrible videos about people getting injured or animals injured. Some of those things can be verified. Some of the videos with the people screaming or yelling or any of those, it's hard to tell, because I've seen on my WeChat moments where people sort of post, like Instagram, there are compounds that are yelling and cheering for the healthcare workers and the volunteers in their community. So there's that piece of it. Some of it is that. So I've definitely seen some where people are like applauding and cheering, similar to back in 2020, how we were doing that for healthcare workers at 6 or 8 at night or whatever that was. Some of that is happening. Some of it, though, for sure is, yeah, you've seen the chance of, we want food or bring us supplies or any number of things. And at times it's hard to tell. And so, yes, I have not seen any of it other than what I've seen online. And again, this overwhelming feeling of the pressure cooker is intensifying. But for most of what I know, the Chinese team that I work with are all positive and upbeat. They're trying to push forward. I mean, you can tell there's fatigue. You can tell they're worried about their aging parents that don't live with them, who aren't as savvy online. There's difficulty there. But I think there's also overwhelmingly people are just trying to push through. So again, 26 million people, which is the 10 top US cities all combined into one, right? You're going to get factions of everything. And so it's always the difficulty in trying to source through how much is it actually aggregating together in terms of dissent in the boiling up of issues, and how much of it is just small pockets here and there. And that's what we have to remind ourselves when we see horrible things happen on videos. I mean, if you look on Reddit, there's terrible things. People in the Baymax suits and the white, they're either punching or pushing or doing whatever. And it's at times we have to step back from even trying to participate in those communities, because it starts to feel too overwhelming, these moments of.
Yeah, I should ask, like, what happens, by the way, if you decide after we finish this Zoom, you want to go take a stroll outside right now? What would happen to you, or what do you think would happen to you?
What would happen to me? I think probably the guards at the front would be real confused, would probably start to chase after, right? I would imagine I would be restrained at some point, and then I don't know if it's.
They haven't told you like
issue.
explicit law, like if you walk outside, you get put in jail or you get sent somewhere.
No, and there's some videos of that. Some people have left, and they get apprehended in some way, and then, like most stories, don't know the end of it. Don't know if they go to jail. Don't know if they go to a central quarantine unit. It's really altogether unclear. And the penalty, and the penalties aren't broadcast in any of these notices that go out, right? It's stay home, stay safe, keep your community safe, and we'll stay strong together.
What do people do with pets, by the way, who need to take their pets out?
I've heard of some people will sneak out at night, very few. But then for the most part, most people have balconies to some degree. And so they're trying to encourage their pets to go outside. There was some collecting of leaves and some outdoor materials to bring upside before lockdown happened. So there's that in terms of basic needs. Pet care has been one of the hot topics if you test positive, because early on, several weeks ago, there was a video of a dog killed as its owner was taken into quarantine. And so the dog was left behind. That was one. There was a corgi just a few days ago or in the last week. So there's been at least 2 videos. And it's different from district to district in terms of what's going to happen to animals. So there's chatter around don't sign anything, because there's some rumor is there's been some Chinese things that like if you're signing, you kind of sign away your rights to your animal. But mostly it's and I don't have pets, but it's people rely on their neighbors because or you have a fallback plan, which is like, if I test positive, would you take my animal? And in some other communities, the staff or the guards will volunteer to walk animals, to walk dogs. It's really inconsistent. Again, it's just different. It just depends sort of from compound to compound or district to district, what the rules are, and how strict some of them are kept. We're pretty lucky here in that we still go down to the front desk. There's a lot of food exchange that happens. Someone needs something, or we want to split a group order, and you can take it downstairs and put it on the table in front of the elevator, and like people will just asynchronously go get it. So I would say our unit is not the tightest, but we definitely all still follow the rules. No one's leaving, no one's going outside.
And I mean, it sounds relatively amicable, but like, are there any examples that come to mind in terms of the tensions that are rising? You know, have you seen some conflict, at least verbal, happening in your area?
Not verbal from here. Every once in a while we live on the 30th floor, and every once in a while we'll hear some yelling going on. And so we'll go outside or look outside and try to figure out where it's coming from. Unclear what it is, and we don't speak Chinese even if we can. But every once in a while we'll hear stuff. People do go on their balconies every once in a while to yell or scream. But then where we haven't heard it in real life, it definitely bubbles up in WeChat. And it's not just here. I was talking to someone in my team who lives well beyond us. Everyone agrees there's a lot of drama happening in the WeChat, a lot of pointing fingers, a lot of flared emotions. I mean, so I think if people aren't outwardly showing signs of dissent, it is coming out in different ways. And it's typically coming out in these, like, not towards the government or even potentially towards the staff or the compound people, but with each other, because people are frustrated. People are confused. Even Chinese nationals themselves think that the government has sort of bungled how things have been going here. Hope for better days, but it's coming out in some sort of personally nasty ways that are just, I mean, you'd expect, but it's always disheartening to see.
You were describing to me that you cut your hand recently, and you felt quite a bit of panic. If you need non-COVID medical care, how does that work right now?
Yeah, so what we've seen in this, so here's my two Band-Aids right here. That was another issue I think they solved in the first week or two, once the lockdown started, is because there were people having really emergent need who could not get into hospitals, but either because they couldn't leave their compounds. And again, unsourced by me, but like people who died who couldn't get access to care. And then probably you can find those or source those yourself. They've since changed that to some degree, which is like, if you have emergent care, you can dial your neighborhood phone number and they'll try to let you out, and they will, in theory, give you access to a hospital. So when I cut my hand 4 or 5 days ago, you know, our compound has no cases. We talked previously around, like, if someone needed to go out to a hospital, I imagine that they would reset the clock on our entire compound, because someone has then been in the outdoors, they've experienced life beyond what our situation is right now. And so that was my concern, not beyond just like needing stitches, but was like, am I going to reset the clock?
Is everyone going to give you, yeah, they're going to be like that American.
Yep.
Burned us for
Yeah. And so, nope. So we staunched the bleeding. I've super glued my hand closed twice now, just because I won't be the person to leave. It's not that bad. So it was like I had a mini panic attack, just really concerned about what if I was really in danger, and how would we handle that? And honestly, I guess we would go downstairs and start seeing who could help us, and then trying to get out somehow.
Have you given thought to trying to come back to the States?
A good question. We have talked about it. Absolutely. How can you not? We have decided not to. So I've just extended my contract for another year. We'll stay through July of next year. When we temporarily relocated with the original COVID outbreak, it was highly disruptive, right? Disruptive to all kinds of things. And it was so hard to come back that no, our plan is to stay. We've thought about going, of course, but no, we will stay. We do know people who are considering it. And there's people even in our compound who have tickets, like 3 sets of tickets lined up for 3 weeks in a row, in case flights get canceled or in case things happen. But even to get to the airport right now, so you have to procure a ticket, and then you have to work with your your neighborhood or your compound to get approval to leave, to go get a test, because you have to have a negative test within 48 hours to travel. So you have to and then have a licensed driver, like a permitted driver, an approved driver who has negative tests to take you to the hospital, get that. And then same thing, you have to find a car to take you to the airport, which is about 45 minutes out of town. Same thing, get all the right paperwork, all the right permissions, the right approvals to even get yourself to the airport, and then hope a flight isn't canceled on the way out. So it's been really hard to come into and out of China in the last 2 years, right? That's one of the reasons they've been able to maintain mostly COVID zero in the mainland. And now just with Shanghai being in so much turmoil here, it's made an already really complicated situation that much harder. And so we will stay until either something dramatic changes, more dramatic than where we're at. Again, if we were 3 meals from the end of our pantry, maybe it would be a different conversation. But we're in an exceptionally privileged place, where it's not, I've stopped buying food, we're eating off what we can, and it's how can we help others? How can we send stuff out? My company has been so good. They already sent 1 box last week that came. We sent our box on, a second one is gonna come, and I'll send it on again. But the critical decisions that people are making is, do I keep this food or do I send it away to somebody who needs it more? In a lot of cases, it's I'm sending it to my elderly parents who have nothing in their cupboards. And so again, for me, it's really hard, and I sit with honestly a lot of guilt, because I'm probably sitting in the very top percentile of people in terms of our stockpile and food and what we have. But I can tell you, kind of almost to wrap it all together, I saw online again a screenshot of a WeChat group that, and I don't know her name offhand, I could find it if you were interested. Basically, the lead venture capitalist in Shanghai, a woman who created JD.com, which is essentially almost like Amazon selling, had joined her compound's WeChat group asking how to get bread. And so it was like, we're in this moment where for a while, it doesn't matter what kind of money you have at all. Like money will get you somewhere for sure, because prices are intense. They've risen to some degree. But at the end of the day, so everybody's in this same situation, sort of at the mercy of what their neighborhood or compound will allow. And it's settling down. Like, my anxiety is much lower this week as opposed to last week, even opposed to the week before. But again, I'm in a crazy privileged position where I work from home. I'm not worried about finances. I continue to work my full-time job, but so many people who aren't working, don't have access to food. They're concerned about, their aging parents and family members. And then above all else, really no one has any idea when things will end or how they will change, because China's dedicated to COVID zero.
Yeah. Talk to me about the testing regimen. I mean, the big issue in the States for a long time was like, we don't have enough tests. How does testing work there? Do you guys all line up? How do you get your alerts to test? How often are you testing? How does the whole process work?
We have no idea when we'll be tested. I think since March 9th or 10th, I've probably been tested 20 times, 25 times, a mixture of them doing it, the white suits versus at home. So they've introduced some antigen tests at home where we do some of them at home. Totally unclear. Sometimes a notice will get sent, like, we'll test tomorrow. Basically, when our community tests us, because it's handled, again, locally, everything's done at the neighborhood level, we'll either get a phone call or a knock on the door, which that when they indicate, like, you can go down and test. Our community, again, is really well organized, really well, they space people, they make sure that we're not crowding. That's not the same across the city. You'll see videos where they think those are the super spreader events, are the lines to test, because people are just jammed up inside in small corridors and gateways. We do nearly every one of our tests is taken place outside. So in China, you live and die by QR codes. So you fill out in advance, like, all your information, your passport number, your national ID, and they always scan it before they test you. They do batch testing here. So they batch basically 20 tests into a single tube at any given time. And then they'll test that just once. And then if a positive comes out of that test tube, they'll retest those 20 people to find out who is positive. So it's basically the way that they can test. I'll tell you, like, I can't remember what day it was last week, but 2 or 3 times now, they've done an entire citywide testing in 24 hours. So we're talking 26 million people get tested within a 24-hour window. And so just thinking about the scale and scope of that is mind-boggling. Again, we get lucky. The latest we've ever done one was 9 o'clock at night, but a lot of people will test in the middle of the night. They'll wake up to a knock on the door and people, like, get up, you got to come test. And so that the batch testing enables them to move quicker. But then if there are positives, they have to come back and like ferret that out to figure out who is the positive case.
And so let's talk about that for a second, because we alluded to Camp COVID. So if you test positive, if one of your daughters tests positive, if your husband, what do you understand about the process? Because I've also understood, especially early on, they were separating parents from children. What do you know about that process? And are there any anecdotes from neighbors or friends that you've heard from?
Yep. So a mixture. Nobody in my direct line of either family or friends has gone, but yes, one beyond that, I've heard many stories. So basically, you test positive, you'll get a text or a phone call, and basically they indicate they're going to come pick you up. So you have a little bit of time. In early on, it was like you had maybe a couple hours. Pack a bag. Now with so many positive cases, they have, I can't remember the latest numbers, how many cases, 70,000 plus, 100,000, like a number of people are all at Central. Some people aren't getting picked up till 3, 4, 5 days later.
And this is asymptomatic and symptomatic, regardless.
Doesn't matter. Yep, yeah. Doesn't matter. And most of the cases, if you look at the numbers, and I'm sure you'll pull the numbers are overwhelmingly asymptomatic. People don't feel ill at all. And so you get picked up. So you can pretty much, from what I understand, take pretty much anything into quarantine. Into Central, what we call Camp COVID, Camp Quarantine, whatever, some centralized unit. You go and then you spend however long you need to stay there until you can have 2 negative tests. So you have to have 2 negative test results and then they'll send you home. So yeah, in the early days, if the parents, children, whoever was positive, they'd split. They'd split you up. Children were not staying with parents. Children, if tested positive, were sent to a children's ward, a children's hospital, and parents were sent elsewhere or stayed at home. So wildly confusing, that situation. There was the American consulate had a call maybe 10 days ago or so, and they acknowledged that was happening and that there were Americans who had been separated. And so that's definitely, it's been on the minds of anyone with young kids, especially people like us who our kids don't speak Chinese, to think through like what would happen if anyone were to test positive. Where would we go? What would happen if my husband and I were pulled away and the girls weren't? What would happen to them here? All really unknown and pretty not super well understood, because nobody we know was in that position. They changed that policy about a week ago. I think the government was feeling a lot of pressure from its own citizens and probably from other consulates here who have presence here in Shanghai as well. They've changed that policy again, but it's all like you can apply to stay together. Assumption is they're hopefully greenlighting anybody who applies for that. Through a friend, we know a mother and a son who were just taken away maybe 3 or 4 days ago. They shared some videos of where they were taken as a holding pen before going to a formal expo center or stadium. It was horrific. It was like an abandoned outdoor space that had some tents set up. The toilet was a hole in the ground. And again, this was just like a queuing space. I don't know how many hours they were there. They were eventually moved on to a kind of one of these more formal setups that you've probably seen videos of. They turned the International Convention Center into a 15,000 bed place. But the numbers are so high here in Shanghai, they're busing people to nearby provinces many hours away at this point. And it's unclear to us, like, what happens when you test positive? Do they bring you back home as well? Or are you just kind of stranded out in Wenzhou? Like, no one, again, it's just unknown. Nothing.
But
clear.
Your understanding as a parent now is that regardless of who tests positive, the Chinese will allow you to stay with your children.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the hope. And again, yeah, there's some real hope behind that belief, right? That you want to believe that that's how it would happen. But I mean, there were comments in WeChat groups here about we're going to start sharing food with our kids at home, right? Doing anything to make sure that if you were one of you were positive, you were all positive, or just to stay with your kids.
But we've all experienced this now for 2 years, where like I've had friends where like everyone but one person in the house tests positive, and that person never tests positive, and it's we don't have a clear command for COVID yet,
right?
Even 2 years.
Right. Yeah.
What have you taken away from this whole experience, especially these past 6 weeks? I mean, you've lived in the US, you've lived in China for a number of years. What has anything changed in terms of how you think about things, how you think about life?
Yeah, I think that's a really thoughtful question. Someone asked us a couple of days ago, an American, like, how does it feel to be the only country locked down? And to be honest, I don't know if it was coming from a really positive place or kind of unclear. But the best, my husband Paul and I have talked about this quite a bit, is every country on earth has grappled with how to handle COVID. And every country's done it different and to differing levels of success, right? The US sort of did the bare minimum with some mask mandates, with some virtual schooling for a while, but very little. Well, the bare minimum, let's call it that. There was plenty they did, but a million people died. Here in China, this pendulum has swung the complete opposite way, right? There's this really strong overreaction to what we now know is a mild flu case for most people, right? And we can talk more about why they're worried about their elderly population and the vaccine if you're interested. But right, there's real concern. So there's a way overreaction. It's really hard for Americans until you spend substantial time in Asia or in a country that is more community minded than America to truly understand kind of the differences in culture. And even still, we struggle at times, even after 3 years, to try to understand it. And so do we love being locked down to infinity? No. Is this the right way to do it? Probably not. Maybe with some advanced thinking, they had 2 years to plan for it, right? It could have been handled differently, but I don't have that brain space or power to solve for that, right? And the countries of the world have bungled it in one way or another, or had success in one way or another. The way I think about it isn't going to change things. And so what has been super incredible to see, though, is despite all this chaos, like, neighbors are looking out for neighbors. People are helping people, trying to solve in any which way. If someone posts on Reddit about having suicidal thoughts, people jump in with support. They jump in with phone numbers to call, with WeChat organizations to add. How can I support? If you want to DM me and talk, let me know. Here in our neighborhood, it's, hey, I have this overabundance of greens, who would like it and would leave it. People here giving food to the staff all the time, right? It's like there's this neighbor looking out for neighbor, which is a really, really incredible thing to see. It's like the heartening, it's like the silver lining of all of it. We know our neighbors in much better ways, the people we live in our communities about. And so it's, again, hard times, everybody always quotes Mr. Rogers and like, look for the helpers. And we can feel very helpless in the system in which we find ourselves right now, but there are moments where we can make incredible difference on individual based levels. And so again, I'm lucky because I'm here with my nuclear family. We're all here. I don't worry about adult children who live elsewhere, or I don't have aging parents here. I have people on my team who live alone, people who just moved to Shanghai literally the week before we locked down. They live alone. And so I'm more worried about those sorts of people. And so it's also, how do I take this moment to look outward as opposed to just focusing on myself? And of course, we had to get to the point where we're steady and consistent and had enough food, but now we're definitely like trying to turn outward and look outward. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's like there's not a real solve here. We're trying to make the best of it, because like most hard things, the only way out is through. And unless we pay through the nose and abandon my contract and get on a flight to land back in Portland, where we have nowhere to live and nowhere to stay, like, this is our home and we're committed to being here. And so it's trying to figure out how to make an impact, small, medium, or big, where we can, and try to make the best of the situation for our family and then the people around us as well.
Very well said. Was there any point in the past 6 weeks where you felt unsafe? I mean, you were describing this collective, collectivist, feeling neighbor for neighbor, but when medicine is dwindling and food isn't available, it tends to be every person for themselves. Was there ever a sense that you feared it getting to close to that situation?
Yeah, I would say probably in like the first week of the hard lockdown, like my side of the river, Pudong, we had 4 hours of notice before we would hard lock down for 4 days. The other side of the river had 4 days to prepare. And so this side of the river, it was a scramble. And so we were already locked into our compound, so we couldn't do anything anyway. But we had friends who were going out to the stores. And yeah, it was sort of chaos at the stores, Black Friday-ish shopping, right? Just trying to grab goods. And it was definitely, everybody was just trying to focus on themselves. It was rough our first week, when those 8 or 9 days where we could not have food delivered in. I worry. I have young kids. How do we have, we could eat spaghetti every day, we could eat rice every day, but how do we have milk or bread or eggs? And then you add greens or fruits and vegetables on top of that, it changes things a little bit. And so there was some real concern, and those conversations took place around, like, what should we do? Will our company send us away in the same way they did 2 years ago, or were we gonna like ride this out and see what happens? And I did feel a lot of concern early on, where I'd set myself like 2 days to say, like, okay, in 2 days I'm going to reach out to the GM here, and I'm going to say, what are you considering about expats? Has there been any conversation? Just because they were pretty quick to send us out 2 years ago. But comparing, contrasting 2 years ago to now, right? 2 years ago, the virus was really new. It wasn't well understood at all. And now we're not worried. Again, personally, the people we know aren't worried about dying from COVID, from the Omicron variant that's here. It's very mild. But what are the other concerning things around it? The ramifications that COVID is bringing into the system here, which is, lack of access to medicine, lack of access to food, mental health issues, and those sorts of things. And so, no, we've never been in like I've never been in a full meltdown situation. I think really the only time I cried is when I cut my hand open and I was worried about whatever. That was my mini panic attack. But no, mostly it's been like, okay, we got to stay out of Camp COVID. We got to stay together. So don't test positive. And even, there's a likelihood our compound will open today. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. And so, but then what, right? So now we have to rely on our 800 neighbors to stay COVID free. But where are we going to go? What are we going to do? We have scooters here, being like tiny e-bikes. The batteries are charged. We're ready to roll, just to be outside and to go outside, but won't plan to see anyone, won't plan to go anywhere. There's nothing open anyway, but now it's just like, how do we stay negative? And then it's unclear to me, once they open, what does the ongoing testing strategy look like? Because you can't dodge a test. That's the other wild thing here, is that it's not like you opt into a testing scenario like you did in the States. It's like they will come and find you. And some of the videos you see are people not wanting to be tested, or who, so unknown. That's like the best adjective to describe everything in the whole situation, is unknown.
Unknown. Are you allowed to open your windows?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can open.
Some videos went around being like, don't open your windows.
Yeah. So interestingly, I saw that the translation checked on that just this morning. Someone posted and wanted to make sure, because what the Western media was sourcing, it said like, don't open your windows or sing. It was the drone, in the video. And someone did confirm that that's what it's saying, with a mild alteration, that it's don't open your window and sing, as opposed to or sing. Like, you can still sing at home, whatever. But basically there's the other interesting thing about COVID here versus in the States is the idea of Western versus Eastern medicine is very different. And so even how people in the government think that COVID spreads versus what we in the West have been told are different. And so, for instance, I got a message from someone I hardly work with that said, like, it's been talked about that COVID is spreading through drains, especially drains that aren't used very often. Rinse them down or cover them with plastic. Right. So
like
we
your
hear
shower
that
drain or your
I think
sink
so.
drain?
Maybe okay. Like a drain, and again, sort of like, okay, from what I know about COVID, it's an airborne illness. I don't know that it's going to survive in a drainage system. Okay. Anyway, so just sort of these handful of things. And so again, this idea that maybe you're singing or screaming from your balcony and you're going to infect others, or unknown, unclear. But it is interesting to watch. And then again, like how what you might take or not take to prepare yourself for COVID is sort of a funny thing to watch.
A couple final questions here. One, how have you explained to your daughters what this is and what's going on?
I say this lovingly, and any parents of young kids will laugh. Like our kids are kind of dumb. I mean, they're 3 and 5, and honestly, for the last 2 years, you know, COVID's been a thing. And so when we were in the States, we stayed at home. We're sort of homebodies anyway. I mean, they go to bed at 7 o'clock at night, right? So we do a lot at home. They know about COVID, but they don't mind testing now, which is great because we get tested very often. They're not afraid.
By the way, the Chinese test, is it always straight up the nose? Is that what they're doing?
It's been mostly mouth, which is great, which is great because yeah, those early brain scrubs, like when we came back to China in the airport, oh man, like that's a real brain swirl. They still do the brain swirl at the airport, but not so much on these tests. So no, just mouth, though our home antigen tests are nose. But again, like no one's going up nearly probably as far as they ought to be. But they know, you know, what we tell them is we stay home because people are getting sick. We don't want to get sick. We don't want, you know, and they get that. And so they're smarter than they appear, I know, but like mostly they don't mind so much as long as we, you know, stay playing with them and keep them active as much as we can. Again, it would do them a world of good to go outside. Again, we'd be thrilled to stay inside our compound if we could go outside. And so those few days or nights when we do need to test, you know, people push the rules quite a bit. They'll take the long way to loop the buildings a couple times. We woke our girls up to go test, and so they were hardly awake, but we stayed outside and walked the buildings a couple times just so they could remember the outdoors.
and there's already an issue with fresh air sometimes in China.
Yeah. But luckily it's spring, the weather's been really nice here. And so, yeah, no, windows are open, we just to air our place out, and we'll look forward to getting out and seeing what happens.
So between what people see in the media and what they hear from politicians, you know, a lot of Americans have gotten certain impressions about China, heard a lot about China the last couple of years. You've spent the better part of the last 3 years in China. When you talk to, you know, your friends and family back in the States, and generally speaking, what are you telling folks about China, what you've learned about China, and things that Americans should know about the country?
Oh, brilliant question. You know, anybody well, let me tell you, before my grandma died, she traveled quite a bit, and she told me something that I've thought a lot about, which rings really true now, which is in all her travels around the world, she really just learned, didn't matter where she went, all the people were essentially the same in one way or another. They cared about their families, they cared about the environment in which they lived, and about trying to have a good life. And I've thought about that as I've traveled myself, and now living here, right? The people, similar to the States, the people are not necessarily the politics. The people are not necessarily the generalized thought you have about a specific country. And so like getting to know the people here, they're so friendly. They want to help in any way. I've received so much assistance in my time here from my colleagues, from people we live around, people who are anxious to help us when we're out and about. People are ultimately just trying to eke out the best life they can with the time that they have. And people, for the most part, and it may be, again, the colleagues that I surround myself with are college educated. Their experience is slightly different. They have more money probably than the median income for Chinese citizens. So maybe it's different. Shanghai is, of course, the most international city in all of China. So our experience could be different. But even we've traveled extensively within China because we haven't been able to leave the last 2 years that we've been here. And it doesn't matter where we go, people are kind, they're polite. We've only had one exchange at one time with somebody who had some things to say to us as foreigners, but for 3 years with as many people as we've seen, it's pretty remarkable to see that. And our friends and family at home, even still, I don't think they really see that and get that. We keep a daily log of our time in China and have spent time online trying to explain what it's like in China and how similar it is, and at times how dissimilar it is. But the dissimilarities aren't life-changing in the way that people care about their families and they love their kids and their parents and they try to work. And so at the end of the day, like, we've seen substantial differences, but the people themselves are they're just like us. And it's one of the reasons we don't mind staying. We like being here because we've had a great experience. And it's been an adventure, of course, but it's changed our lives in a number of ways. But at the end of the day, it's been lovely. And so it's hard, honestly, in a place like Reddit. So we participate in there's a Shanghai subreddit there, and we've been part of it for 2 years. People ask questions, where can I go? What's the best place for brunch? People are super chatty. But in the last couple of weeks, the readership of that subreddit has grown substantially. And it's been inundated with trolls, with a lot of people who have things to say. Why don't you just leave, or down with the CCP, or just a lot of really negative talk. And it's unfortunate to see, of course, because it just doesn't match to the expectation, like to our actual experience of being here. And so it's unfortunate that those opinions exist, but there is some reality probably. But when you actually break it down to the people are just, the vast majority of people are just trying to make a good life for themselves.
And just to take a piece of that, I think a surprise a lot of Americans have is the level of tolerance, if you will, that the Chinese people have for their government and the amount of control. I mean, even what you're going through right now is not something many Americans would be remotely, willing to go through here in the States. What have you learned about that? Why is it that about the population and their tolerance of the amount of control the government has over them?
I'll be honest, most of what I know and think is from what I've read. We don't talk a lot of politics with the people that I work with for one reason or another, right? It just seems it's just
it's better left unsaid as far as they're concerned, right?
It's a third rail we leave alone. In a lot of cases, they leave me alone about US politics as well. So it's a mutually beneficial agreement we're all sort of we reside under. But so from what I've read, like, a lot of people here view the CCP's control as security. Coming out of the Cultural Revolution that most people's grandparents and great grandparents survived, the control has maintained stability here. There has been economic success. There has been growth of the GDP, growth of the economy. They have seen that. But yeah, now more so than in our entire time here, we're seeing people grumble and complain and question. And again, I don't think there will be an uprising, a large scale. I'll be interested to see what happens. Of course, I think the next week or two are going to be pretty critical in terms of the boiling over of the feelings at hand. But I think for the most part, people look at the good that's been done and are happy to reside in that system. And that, again, that may be a really sophomoric take on a really complex matter. And so I'm not the expert in that whatsoever.
No,
some of it seems to ring true.
I didn't have this conversation to get your, to force you to be a political analyst, but was just curious because that's always, naturally where the biggest, one of the first questions that comes up for most Americans.
Well,
right?
and I think what is surprised us is not every Chinese member is a member of the party. And so I don't know what the split is. I don't know what the division is, but like, I have seen resumes where people will highlight that they are a member of the party. I have people on my team who are. I don't think it fundamentally changes the outlook one way or the other. So it's mostly just an interesting thing to note. I think I was under the assumption that everyone in China was a member of the CCP. That's not the case.
Natalie, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. Wishing you fresh air very soon, for you and your daughters and your husband, and a return to normalcy, or whatever normalcy existed prior to this.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the understanding. Again, it's just until people hear about it firsthand and understand a little bit more the complexities of it, I think, start to like sink in and make some sense for people about what life is like. And the last thing people in the States ask all the time is like, how can we help? What can we do? And like, sincerely, there isn't anything other than awareness. If you know people, checking in, and then probably at a base level, just this is a myopic thing to think, it's like understanding the lockdown you went through in 2020, 21, and early 22 potentially is nowhere near what's happening here. And so some empathy maybe for people you don't know, but it's fine. Like, we'll survive. Something will change. That's the one thing I've learned in the last few weeks here. Something will change when we least expect it.
For those in less fortunate circumstances, though, are there charities that people can donate to in order to help folks? I mean, is there, I don't know, an equivalent of whatever the Red Cross, or some way to aid the people who need help?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Not that I know of. The best I've seen is like on Reddit, someone posted and said like, are you a foreigner who needs help? We're some Chinese people trying to assist. And again, none of it's vetted, none of it's well understood. And so sadly, there's nowhere I can direct people.
There's not like a huge nonprofit sector in China that, you can.
No, not that I know of offhand.